Hello, folks, and welcome to Domino Theory. This is the reboot of Simon and Whiton, the podcast about U.S. politics, the media, and business, especially with an eye to Asia and America's role there. I'm Christian Whiton, joined as always by co-host Mark Simon. But Domino Theory will also be joined by guests who buck the conventional wisdom and offer insight you won't get elsewhere. On this episode, we'll be joined by Steve Yates, a former Deputy National Security Advisor, chairman of the Idaho Republican Party, and a guy at a think tank who actually thinks, to name a few of his other career highlights. But first, the lead-in. Let's talk about Kamala Ding Dong, Kamala Harris, the vice president of our great nation and the Democrat nominee for president. It's about 2 months until the election, and early voting begins soon and will pick up a lot of steam in just about a month. Last Thursday, Harris finally did something most presidential candidates do several times a week, sometimes multiple times a day. She gave an interview. This one went to CNN, the once respected news network turned Trump-deranged political tabloid. Harris's performance fit well with her campaign so far. The strategy there has been to say as little as possible of substance and hope that enthusiastic media support, lots of donor money, and even enough to dislike by some of Donald Trump's styles and policies and other things will push her over the finish line. I don't think the strategy is working. Furthermore, this campaign style, which is basically an updated version of keeping Joe Biden in his basement during the 2020 campaign, means she's missing the opportunity to sharpen up her policies and her talking points before she has to debate Trump sooner or later. And there is actually a debate scheduled, at least for now, for September 10th. Harris knows she's in trouble on two big issues, inflation and the border. On inflation, she's trying to blame the supermarkets for price gouging, which is a hoot for a notoriously low-margin business. On the border, she's trying to deflect to the phony legislation that Democrats tried to pass in Congress earlier this year, purporting to do more and spend more on the border. That was just legislative theory intended to shift blame to Republicans. But in reality, everyone knows that Biden-Harris policy changes open the border and let in millions of illegals, some of which are very bad hombres. Everyone knows that the policies under Trump were better at controlling the border. Now, when foreign policy comes up in the campaign, Trump usually warns that we're close to World War III because of Biden-Harris policies. Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, tried to throw some help to Kamala's campaign, not usually the part of the national security advisor's job description. Bloomberg reported that he said, quote, Vice President Harris has been a central member of the Biden foreign policy team. She's had the opportunity to engage herself with President Xi and Premier Li. So you know she is both on top with both leaders of China, end quote. I'm sure they were both super impressed by their brush with Kamala greatness. Interesting footnote, it turns out that Mark's imprisoned boss, dissident Jimmy Lai, is also known to both of those men. I wonder who scares them more. This presents an interesting decision tree. On one branch, was Kamala really involved with foreign policy? If so, how does she explain the disaster in Afghanistan, Iran's march across the Middle East, failure in Ukraine, and the unrequited romancing of Chinese officials by Biden-Harris cabinet members? Or, on the other hand, the other branch was Sullivan lying, and Harris somehow managed not to influence or learn much about foreign policy despite technically being on the National Security Council these past 4 years. That's where I'm putting my money. Either way, voters have no idea what Harris would do differently than Biden on China or other foreign policy issues, or really even any issue. So far, all we've got is fluff. All right, now let's welcome in Steve Yates, our guest. I mentioned, Steve, your bio at the top of the introduction, but, I remember seeing you giving a speech somewhere. It was a campaign stop or an event in Washington, and you'd mentioned that in your life you'd been, I think, a missionary, a spy, a bureaucrat, a wonk. Could you kind of hit the highlights for us once more? I like the way you do it better than I.
Well, thank you, Christian and Mark. I kind of did a bunch of different things. I was a little bit like Forrest Gump's feather blowing in the wind, from being a missionary, a spy, a think tanker, did have 5 years of solitary confinement in the White House and the vice president's office. It was an interesting point of view, and I have a particular fondness and interest in the vice presidency, which may or may not be a part of our conversation today, since we have an interesting nothing burger of a nominee on one side, and I think an interesting personality on the other. And after leaving the White House, done a number of different things, from bloviating on TV and radio, hopefully with something reasonable to say from time to time, and gave into the great cancer of politics for a part of my life, where I took the absolute worst job in politics, which is a state party chairman, and served two terms for that, and at my expense in many different ways. But did learn a great deal, and was a member of the RNC, that much maligned organization, sometimes deservedly so. It was an interesting lesson in life. But these days, happy to be in think tank world, offering policy advice to those who take it. But I'm always mindful of what Vice President Cheney somewhat disappointingly and chillingly told me at one point along my journey there. I pay you to give me advice. I am under no obligation to take it, which hurt my delicate soul at the time. But I have found that to be absolutely true in the public sector and private sector.
Very good. All right. Well, Mark, perhaps you could, I'm very interested in why that's the worst job in politics, but Mark, perhaps you could check a question at Steve. But did you have any thoughts on my lead-in either about the state of the campaign?
Quite frankly, Steve has always been one of the people that I've always turned to when it comes to China. And, I think that's the real question about Kamala I'm not saying her name right, about Vice President Harris, is that essentially we don't know where she stands on China. We just have no idea. While she may have been in the room, who knows? You know what I'm saying? But my question to you is like, I think of China and I think of a guy named Wang Hunin, basically their American Western know-it-all, the guy who sees all and does all this. And I have to think that he's looking right now at Harris and Walz and thinking to himself, okay, we've got these two. This is not a problem for us. I was just wondering, what's your take on the Chinese take right now on our election?
Yeah, Mark, well, we've lived through a lot of these cycles, and one of the greatest frustrations I've had over my entire life is that there is an entire cottage industry in China to analyze every one and every statement in America with regard to American thoughts and recommendations towards China. And very, very few Americans who know anything really of any value about the same in China. And also shockingly few people who consider carefully their own interactions with these people from China. So there's definitely an America school inside the Chinese Communist Party and across places that don't seem like they're in the party in China, who have studied every single thing that Kamala Harris has ever said about China. But that's probably a short study. Most of her public life has really been in other subject areas. Even as a senator, not that much on things international. She's most famously known for confrontations in the Judiciary Committee with regard to Supreme Court and other judicial nominees, much less known on foreign policy issues. And even as vice president, she sure seemed uncomfortable and certainly not eloquent or verbose about her thoughts or the reasons behind policies during the Biden administration when she was sent to Europe or to China. So I think they probably come up with very little about where she would be, but they're kind of comfortable with that because they sense an establishment engagement mindset behind it. And then with her vice presidential nominee, they have someone who has come and gone to China most of his adult life. And he has played very well with the friendly engagement arms of the Chinese Communist Party and some of their other outreach organizations, and even brought some people from China into advisory circles in his state government in Minnesota. And so I think that when they look at this team, they have a great deal of uncertainty of where they would stand, but they have a great deal of confidence that they know that this is not a team that is sure-footed about pushing back against them. Much more inclined to listen, engage, and try to kind of negotiate peace than a team that is willing to stand up and push them to change their behavior.
I'm going to follow up on one other question, because I have always found the Chinese, one of the things that I think they're much more consumed with than over here people look at, and that's because I basically live in Taiwan half the year, is Taiwan. What do you think happens? I mean, there's great unease now starting to take place in Taiwan about this Democratic team. In other words, I think in fairness, they basically looked at the Biden team as, all right, they'll stop anything, the alliances with the Japanese. In other words, you know, they were comfortable. I am now sensing, as I was leaving, and I left before Biden got the heave-ho, but after I left, a few people, mostly KMT, my KMT friends reached out. And, you know, the KMT is not monolithic. There are people there who do not want to be invaded. And what's your sense of the Taiwanese? Because you know that place better than most, actually.
Well, that is where I first went, and a professor said I was going to be lucky to meet the real China. And I've still been looking for the real China, but whatever I found in Taiwan was not that. It was something else. But there's a lot embedded in that question, and there's a huge conversation to have on that. I am more of the view that it's a lot harder for China to attack and hold Taiwan. It is very easy for them to cause mischief, destruction, and they could attack at some point, but more with a mind toward intimidating and hurting. But the Taiwanese people are really hard to swallow and control. They lived through 50 years of Japanese occupation and came out largely with their own identity. They've gone through 25 years of martial law under the KMT with Chiang Kai-shek and largely come out with their own identity. It doesn't mean they've got it all together and they can't be hurt, but I think somewhere there has to be a rational bone in someone's body in Beijing that recognizes this is something that is really hard to swallow. So maybe we don't try to swallow it. Maybe we just bat it around and push the Americans and others out of the way. And that's what I strongly suspect is happening now and on the horizon. And it really, when we have weak and permissive American leadership, they push for limits. There are variables now that didn't exist 10 or more years ago that you would actually know more about than I, like with the Philippines. I can't conceive of why someone in Beijing chose to pick a fight with the Philippines. It's like the least threatening people or country anywhere, and you don't look good attacking it. But they seem to have awakened something there.
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah. They fight. The Filipinos will fight you. You know, they may be standing on the beach throwing rocks, but they're still fighting.
Yeah. That's my impression too. But you've put feet down there and been among them more than I to have a feel for it. So I think there's a lot more in this, and a lot of Americans, with Chinese encouragement, I think are falsely pushed into an impression that this is just a U.S. versus China thing, and Taiwan is just the pawn or the turf in between. The Taiwanese people will have a say. They're not as prepared as I would like them to be. They're not as good at engaging America as they think they are, or as I would like them to be. But Japan has a profound national interest in the People's Republic not controlling Taiwan. Korea has a profound national interest in the People's Republic not controlling Taiwan. It's not talked about, and it's not as high profile in Korea as it is in Japan. And with this X factor of the Philippines and others, it's just a very different environment. But the politics in Taiwan, that is a hall of mirrors. I am allegedly educated, and I have spent a lot of my life going there. I dare say I know more than almost any American who's ever walked in terms of that. And I still would say that there is much more that I don't know and understand than I do know and understand. I agree with you that the KMT is not a monolith, but neither is the DPP. And there's this other force unleashed in Taiwan that is outside of both of those parties that's still to be determined in some ways. I am fine with all of that because I think that is complicating for Beijing. It's probably too much for the American expert community that can't handle anything beyond French words like communique. But we have, but here's where we are. I think it's risky of conflict, but I don't think it's as much risky for occupation as maybe others do. And I would confess to being possibly wrong.
Mark, as Steve alluded, you, of course, yourself have no little amount of experience, not just in Taiwan, in publishing in Hong Kong with Apple Daily, but also in shipping before that in the Philippines and in private equity and real estate. Are you seeing people influence their decisions or change their decisions about investing or building out in Taiwan because of the snowballing of this sort of assumption that it's not a question of if Beijing moves, but when they move on Taiwan?
I mean, the problem that the Taiwanese have most of all is that essentially they don't have a lot to invest in that's available because of the nature of their system and also, quite frankly, a population that's not growing. China, for example, Steve Schwarzman of BlackRock and all they're not making investments in China. The private equity guys are desperately looking for businesses. It's also hard to overstate how the world looks out at the chip industry. And you know, when you look at Taiwan, yeah, they import a lot of machines, but there is an entire infrastructure there. It's almost, you can almost compare it to like footwear, you know, makers in Vietnam and in Fujian. In other words, there's an entire network there. And so there's constantly people looking for investment opportunities there. The real estate market is solid. The banking industry is the banking industry in Taiwan, somewhat reminiscent of the Ottoman Empire. It's old and it's cranky, but the Taiwanese do not seem to be leaving. I would share Steve's 100%. I think it's completely probable, actually, that we're going to have somebody clip wings. We're going to have somebody fire. We're going to have somebody do something in the next few years, just because the Chinese are so aggressive and someone's going to make a mistake. But the idea that you can actually invade Taiwan and hold it in, you know, record speed, I think is, you know, I read these guys sometimes who write about, you know, the Chinese are going to pull down rows and they're going to come over and they're going to you know, do a lot of different things. They're going to, you know, embargoes and all that stuff. I just don't see it. I think the biggest issue that Taiwan has, and I think it's been a missed opportunity for a long time, and hopefully they're getting better. I know the current president's a little bit better than the past president, is they basically have this circular firing squad in Taiwan of domestic politics where they just are completely focused on the wrong thing. I call a significant portion of President Tsai's inner circle and the people around her the Arts and Crafts Club, which has earned me a lot of upset people. But it's like the Arts and Crafts Club. I mean, in other words, it's like they're not really dealing with anything. And I think the new president, he's a military guy. He's proud of his military service. And I think he's trying to prepare the people for what he's really talking about. But in other words, what Steve was saying earlier, I think I wholeheartedly agree. I do not think Taiwan is a layup. And that's what the Chinese have to have. In other words, to take it over. They got to have a layup. The idea that you're going to go to the ground and fight these guys is just problematic. I mean, I've hiked, as fat as I am, I've hiked those hills. I've been around. It's a mountainous region. The Taiwanese know it. And you know, one of the things, the biggest problem is what Steve says about who we meet. It is amazing to me that delegations come to Hong Kong, come to Taiwan, and people are experts in Taiwan. And every single Taiwanese they're talking to spent probably 8 years in the U.S. going to school. In other words, it's like talking to Chinese Americans around Taiwan. It's the same people. And I think it's a huge problem for America. Go out and meet some of these people. I mean, I deal with a construction company down in Tainan. I'm telling you, the entire construction company is basically Marines. And these guys are tough. And they're all in their 30s and 40s. Taiwan gets invaded, and I know what these guys are going to do. They make no bones about it. You'll be having lunch with them, and they'll say, yeah, I'm just going to fight. They wouldn't even think about it. And China would have to deal with that. And the final thing I'd say is there's something going on in Japan about China. I don't know what it is. I'm not an expert in it. But I'm having a really difficult time seeing a Chinese commander leave Okinawa and those northern islands alone if he ever did anything. And then when they did draw Japanese blood, which they would, seeing the Japanese do nothing about it. And I think that's a huge issue for the Chinese. In other words, Japan, you can have the Seventh Fleet, but in my mind, the Japan Defense Forces are probably a multiplier of the Seventh Fleet 2 or 3 times over.
Steve, you mentioned that being the head of a state party is the worst job in the world. I understand, probably because you have to juggle a lot of different constituencies, especially, I guess, maybe the Democrats are this way, although they seem kind of more monolithic and uniform than before. But foreign policy and politics in this particular campaign, where do you see it coming out? I mean, you have Trump saying that it could be World War III, sort of a lot of the problems he says, well, those wouldn't have happened if I had been president, but that's not really a specific, description of what he's going to do. Traditionally, the Republican response to American weakness is we're going to increase the defense budget. It's what Reagan did. It's what W did. Not sure there's a whole lot of room to do that fiscally, given the deficits we're running. I guess my big question is, how do you think foreign politics is playing out in the campaign? And to the extent that it's not really front and center, is that just a reality that you saw as party chairman in Idaho of Americans just not really putting this at the top of their list?
Yeah, well, I obviously have had a soft spot and an interest in foreign policy and national security. And so I have lamented the non-priority role it plays, except when people are concerned that it's going so badly that we are in crisis and need a course correction. That, of course, happened with Vietnam War. It happened with the Iraq War. And there's an element of that is flavoring the discourse, such as it is in this campaign with regard to the Afghanistan withdrawal. We just had some coverage about that tragic anniversary, the fruits of that poison tree, as I would put it. I do think that there is a connecting of the dots with that demonstrated weakness and Putin deciding, I think I can get away with invading again. And that being seen by Iran and its proxies and thinking that on October 7th is something they can go ahead and get away with, while we have kind of division and ideological fervor against Israel in the United States. So I think what we're seeing is a domestic filter onto the approach to the world. And it's coming in with, do you believe in standing with allies or not? That is a little less clear of an issue in Asia. Basically both parties claim to have stood by Japan, Korea, and others, whether true or false or otherwise. NATO is a whole debate unto itself. We've talked about that many, many times. From my point of view, the problem with NATO is Europe. And Europe has to figure itself out, and it has to pay its own way. And Europe has to do a better job of taking care of other Europeans. And that is a much larger variable in American perceptions and support for NATO than the threat from Russia is, which I think most Americans see as very, very distant. Very few Americans believe the Russia, and they're going to steal and manipulate our elections effectively. They do believe that the Chinese have the cyber capabilities, the money, and tech access to try to do some of that. But even that, they might be a little skeptical of how big a factor it is. But I think a lot of Americans have been freaked out about the Middle East blowing up again. So I think it comes into the discourse, but it's not a driving factor. I might be an outlier in that I actually, maybe like the Sixth Sense kids, see a logic to what Trump is talking about that other people might not see. But I also think we're outside of partisan politics with it. I don't see Trump as just the Republican nominee. I see him as representing a force that is outside the party system and in some ways outside the system, as a course correction to both dominant parties. Could be right or could be wrong. I'm still a Republican and I support him in this election. But what I see as the course correction is this narrative of we are going to support our commitment to allies. If they're attacked, we're going to stand by them. But they are going to face tough negotiations and some public jawboning about balancing risk and reward in that. And they are going to have to carry more of the burden in their own region. We're not going to be the first call of 911, and we're not going to be the overwhelming donor and risk taker in conflicts. Now, I say that we may end up doing that, but I see this as a trajectory more than an absolute adjustment. I reject entirely this discussion about isolationism. I think it's stupid. It's mostly coming from academic airheads who are overpaid miscreants who don't actually engage in real world policy. Some of them get to be Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, but what can I say? But really, there is no such thing as isolationism. And I say this as a grieving father of a fentanyl victim. There is no such thing as isolationism. The world comes and grabs our rear ends, whether we like it or not. Our only choice is whether and how to respond. And I see what Trump is shepherding in this coalition. And it's not just Republicans with RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, and there will be others. This is going to be something that's going to make some Republicans uncomfortable. But I see this as a systemic course correction, one that smart allies can find a way to work with, but they're going to have to dial down the establishment and especially media freak out from Washington about it if they're going to be smart about how to do it. I could be wrong. I don't profess to be a prophet, but that's kind of how I see this change.
Can I ask a question of Steve and Kristen? My question is, because you brought up fentanyl. Fentanyl has really got onto my radar screen about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. I must admit I was paying attention to the opioids before that. But, we're going to go, we had 76,000 dead from fentanyl in 2022, 73,000 in 2023. Still huge numbers. The 2024, not even. What is it with the elites in our establishment and this deadly drug that is so traceable back to China? It's not even, it's like, there's not like cocaine that comes from the Peruvian jungles or heroin that comes from a region, and there's mafioso in Sicily that are dealing with it, and Turkish. Fentanyl comes from one spot. It is banked by one group of people, and it's tolerated by one system. And Kristen and Steve, why is it our elites? Because you guys know them better than I do. Why is it our elites just don't give a damn?
Well, at least from my point of view, I am reminded of Jack Nicholson's famous saying of, you can't handle the truth. And I don't think that most Americans are prepared to look this in the face and accept two realities. One is the border. We have at least half of our country that has gone through a pathological mind game, that a tremendously open border with horrendous unknowns and knowns coming across it is not a strategic threat to the American family and community. And because of their hatred of a candidate from the other party, they have somehow been blinded to this reality that they used to actually agree was a problem. So that's one. And then with China, I think it's extremely difficult for the well-heeled elites in both major parties to accept the reality that one of the C's in China is communism, that it is actually an evil regime, that it does actually seek the destruction of the American way of life, especially if we make it easy for them. And then I think the third factor is that, sadly, a lot of people look at fentanyl deaths as just junkies who chose to take drugs. And these are the expendable Americans. And where were their parents in all of this? And I've had people say that to me about my daughter. And my response is, she was one tough SOB for all of her life. And she survived all forms of chemical warfare against her mind and body. But there is something scientifically and chemically different about fentanyl, that she could survive every drug known to mankind. This killed her in her tracks. And it's done that for 200,000 to 300,000 other Americans. And while they might have made bad decisions, and not all of them did, none of them deserve to be poisoned by the Chinese and their cartel friends. I am stunned that there isn't more of an outrage about this. But frankly, I think it's building a little bit between COVID and fentanyl, where across parties in mixed degrees, people want some accountability and at least don't want to deal with the ooky people who've brought this poison into our communities.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, and I think it's consistent with just with what Jack Nicholson said and not handling the truth, is what needs to be done in Mexico. That this is a country that's also taking advantage of us. And on one hand, you can say, well, it's U.S. demand for drugs that is fueling violence. I mean, that was the argument in Colombia too. The flip side is that Mexico is allowing a parallel government to exist in parts of its country that profits from trafficking the stuff in the United States, along with people and other bad things. And we have tremendous leverage over Mexico. I sometimes joke about, Baja California was actually supposed to be California. The surveyors were apparently drunk, so it ended up in Mexico. I don't know if that story is true. Maybe we should take it back. Jokes aside, all we have to do is slow walk the flow of trade across the Mexican border into the U.S. of lawful, actual commerce to put extreme stress on that economy. And a new president should approach Mexico as a friend and say, listen, we want to help you solve this problem of this parallel government. But if they're not going to take the help, then it should be inflicted upon them. And I think it's as simple, not as simple as that. It's as tough as that, and something we don't want to necessarily face right now. Okay, I want to move to another topic, and Steve, stay with us for this one, please. Mark, you spent decades as a media executive, and I just got a sense that something's got to give with the horrendous nature of our media. I certainly wouldn't give CNN an A for its interview with Vice President Harris and her weirdo Veep candidate Tim Walz. But I wouldn't give them an F either. It was conducted by Dana Bash, who always strikes me as sort of sad and gray, like most of their talent. But she did ask questions about inflation and the border, the believability of Kamala's flip-flop and fracking. She wanted it banned until someone told her she might need to win Pennsylvania to win the presidency, and Walz's lies about his media record and other conduct. Bash also pressed them when they evaded those questions, which they did in almost every instance. I don't know. I'm just curious what you thought about it, Mark. And are some networks at least going to try to not come across as completely in the tank for the Democrats, or was this just a one-off?
I think the biggest thing that's happened in major media.
That's for you, Mark.
I'm sorry. I think the biggest thing that's happened in major media is basically they're not economically viable anymore. And what's happened is, the way you keep your job, as Dylan Byers from Puck said, I thought it was pretty good. The way you keep your job in network news, which is ABC, CBS, or NBC, is you not be the one who loses the most. In other words, they're all going down. So you just want to be the one that goes down the least. If you look at some other of the larger publications, like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, they're probably going to be okay because they've got this subscriber base and they do enough work with that base to keep going. But I don't see any future for any of these startups or anybody like that, largely because the fact of the matter is I don't know what happened in journalism schools. I have an idea. And when I have young journalists approach me and they come to me and they go, I'd love to write about foreign policy, and they're 25, or I'd love to write about all these things. I said, have you started to do a crime beat? Have you thought about doing the state house? Have you started about covering local county government with a smaller paper? There are jobs there, but we have really seen what's happened to our media in the terms of they're not making as much money. The investment is not flowing into us. And, I was looking today, CNN is probably for sale. I know I just read today they're approached, and I've heard the same thing, probably almost on a bi-monthly basis with somebody coming up with an idea to buy them. And the value's been going down, down, down. But I myself think no one's going to turn this around. And the reason why is if you don't have owners who are desperately trying to grow a business, what they're trying to do is manage the decline. And when you manage the decline, all you're doing is cutting costs. So, why is Wolf Blitzer still on CNN? Why are half these people still there? If you were trying to grow your business, what would you do? If you're like a sports team, it's like having a 45-year-old quarterback, in the NFL. Well, everybody loves old Joe. He's like really, everybody loves him. He's the greatest thing there is. But why is that? Because the crowd's not coming, and that's the problem. I have to tell you, I have a very dismal view for what I would call the mainstream media. The problem with that is I don't know who's replacing it. And I think also what we're seeing everybody go down their own rabbit hole. In other words, when you look at people's Twitter feeds, and I got this, maybe about 3 years ago, pre-Elon, I met this guy at Twitter, and he was telling me when they look across people's accounts, basically, if they can tell exactly who you are, exactly what you are. And it's not a small thing. It's not like 60-40 following conservative liberal. It's like 95-5. They find the one liberal guy they can tolerate, or the liberals find the one conservative guy they can tolerate. So I really just have to say, I'm not optimistic for the mainstream media. And again, like Steve said on Taiwan, you could talk all day on it, but it's not coming back. There's going to be money-making opportunities for individual journalists, Matt Taibbi, Schellenberger, Barry Weiss. That's going to happen. But I think we're moving quickly past the water cooler days. I mean, I'm old enough, and you guys aren't. We're all, Steve and I are the same age. Steve, we remember somebody would say, "Oh, did you remember what they said? Peter Jennings said last night." Or people had their people, but it was basically the same news, and people had a water cooler discussion. Now, you could turn on CNN, and Trump could give a speech that was pretty good. People liked it. Major policy issue. They'll lead with something completely not there. But I think the real issue is they're not making money. Therefore, management is not trying to make the changes to grow their business. They're managing the decline. And that means that gives a lot of freedom to these people who are not going to be there. Look, salaries at Fox, nobody's making what Bill O'Reilly used to make. Jesse Waters is not making what Tucker Carlson used to make. And when you go into the actual newscasters now, it is not a pretty picture. I mean, CNN is hiring reporters, under $100,000 a year. And if they're lucky, they can grow after 5 or 6 years to basically 200,000 or 300,000, which is good money. I'm not knocking that. But the fact of the matter is that you're not getting the top talent. The people who want to demand that kind of money are just going to go into PR.
Mm-hmm. Now, Steve, from when you were a candidate, from when you were working for that agency of the Department of Defense, so much of your career has been about information. And when you were chairman of the party, I mean, so you have the decline of the media that Mark just mentioned. You have a surprising number of people who still do watch those old newscasts. I've never heard anyone reference one in a political conversation recently, but I don't know if it's just sort of the TV on in the background while you're making dinner type thing. But I don't know. Are conservatives getting through in the new media? Or, you do a Google News search and it's gotten so bad. Every single source on there is liberal. It's the Guardian. It's the Washington Post. It's CNN. It's the New York Times. Only if you do a search of, so if you search today Kamala Harris, it would be all liberal. And if you put Kamala Harris in Fox News or Kamala Harris in Newsmax or something like that, then it might turn up one of those sources. I'm just curious. I mean, the internet and all these new things and podcasts were supposed to flatten the playing field, level the playing field, and also help us get our voice out. Do you think we are? Is it happening?
I think it's happening in many ways. I think more so than a sort of a pessimistic view of the broadcast media. I mean, I share the pessimism about, I think they're reaching fewer and fewer people, and people are paying attention less and less to news that comes through the traditional broadcast networks. But I would look at two different age demographics, the higher end of the age spectrum and the younger end of the age spectrum. Both are really in some ways, very self-selecting where they're getting their inputs. If you go visit someone who is 65 and older, and especially 70 and older, they might have a cable news network on 24/7 in the background. And if they are of one side, they've got Fox going all day and night, whether they're asleep or awake. And if they're on the other side, they've got MSNBC going all day and all night. They're self-selecting what they're going to be consuming by way of news updates, but especially a heavy content of commentary, which anyone that's been in the news business knows you're supposed to have some firewall between news and commentary. And I would just estimate if there ever really was a firewall, it blurred in the 1990s and it doesn't exist anymore. But Mark knows the business better than I do, but that's my perception. But at that age demographic, I think there's a lot of people that are getting either by text or email updates, or they're just consuming on cable all the time. I don't even think they get the traditional newspaper as much as a lot of people did growing up, even the older folks. The younger demographic are going to direct subscription, if anything, and they're going to things like TikTok to just get very small dose things from influencers or maybe primary sources. And every once in a while I talk to people of that age group, and I'm shocked by their thought process that's actually better than I would have expected. And then I'm shocked by the hypnosis they're putting themselves under with no ability to understand the world as I understand it. But I think that we have this combination of the cable subscription on all the time, or people just going direct to sources. The Google AI or the Google algorithm problem has been profound. I mean, I think in our work 15 years ago, you could rely upon a Google News service to kind of gather things for you. And somewhere along the way, it started making decisions for you rather than letting you make decisions for what you wanted to consume. And I think what it's done is just pushed people to direct subscribe. So we'll have big people like a Megyn Kelly, a Tucker Carlson. I think that there's a few others that are more in the centrist realm. Mark mentioned some of those names that came out of the Twitter files genre. Glenn Greenwald has had kind of a second lease on life in that independent media realm. I think there are a lot of people that will subscribe or get from X or other places excerpts of what they're doing. But when I was chairman 10 years ago, I would not have found very many people that were talking, as Mark was alluding, this is what the evening news talked about. What do you think about that? Or even presidential campaigns dying to have that exclusive interview with a network news anchor. I mean, it's just been stunning to me. You would, in times past, they would have wanted a Peter Jennings or a Ted Koppel, much less going back further to a Walter Cronkite, to give them the time of day. We've gone through several presidential cycles where no one paid attention to any of them.
Remember when George H.W. Bush, as vice president, beat the piss out of Dan Rather? That was that was funny. He wanted to do one of those every night if he could.
I mean, Kristen, look, you're actually very, you go on Fox, you go on Newsmax, you're invited around. I mean, do you ever get a phone call from MSNBC? Do you ever get a phone call from CNN? They know you because they're watching all day long. And, traditionally, most print reporters that I used to be, they would read somebody, they'd make a note. Then they'd wait a couple of weeks or a month when the issue resurfaced, and then they'd call that person. I mean, that's how you develop sources. I had a friend who was the head of booking. I mean, she wasn't the head, but she was a senior booking person with CNBC. She had interns that just watched Bloomberg and watched other channels to get names of people who they could book on. And I'd love to talk to her about it again, but she had told me at a certain point in time, certain people became unbookable because producers go, we don't want that guy on our show. We don't want her on our show for whatever reason. And she always said it was political. And so I wonder, do you ever get phone calls from these folks?
It's so interesting. I'll tell you, I made the worst, dumbest business pitch ever in my professional career after I left the Trump administration, because Fox had me on a little bit and CNN still had me on. Actually, it's funny you mentioned Wolf Blitzer earlier, because he has always been fascinated with North Korea. And the first time I was in the State Department, North Korea, part of it at least was in my portfolio. So that got me on at least, usually once every year or something, and then was on more frequently. But I go to CNN and say, I'm the guy who can explain Trump and his policies in a dispassionate, logical way. Dumb. That is the worst pitch ever. That's the last thing they wanted, because the only Republicans they're willing to have on are never Trump Republicans. Same with MSNBC. I've been on them a few times, but it's been years now. I don't actively seek them out. But nonetheless, it's also interesting you bring this up, because there's a story, I forgot where I just saw it. I may have seen it on Bloomberg, about how Fox has actually significantly increased the number of Democrats they've had on. Democrats also going into an election cycle, realizing that reaching those last 10 or 20 or 30,000 voters in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan does require going on to uncomfortable channels where the prevailing point of view is different. But yeah, the answer to your question is no. Liberal networks don't call me up very much.
It's a shame. I mean, I'm watching this guy, Scott Jennings, and he's on CNN, and he's tearing it up. And there's a guy over at CNBC, Joe Kernan, and all of a sudden they're reaching into new audiences that are paying attention to them for the first time. And I think it's a shame that they don't do it. But there's also a movement to fire Scott Jennings right now. All the liberal media are trying to get him fired. I think sooner or later they will get him after the election. I would very much doubt that Scott Jennings has much of a career after November. I'd say after January. I think they'll find
CNN, but he'll have a career somewhere.
Oh, I think we'll see him over at Fox, or we'll see him over someplace else. But I do think, Steve, for example, the one thing that's also kind of shocked me in this same rabbit hole is the think tanks in Washington, D.C. Now, God knows, I have no idea what Heritage was doing with 2025. I mean, I don't think anybody had any idea what was going on with that. But I do think that, that has changed as well. In other words, you rarely see on MSNBC or someplace else, you rarely see or CNN a conservative think tanker anymore either. And that used to be safe ground. In other words, if you're looking for a conservative, get somebody from Heritage, get somebody from AEI, and it was easy. It was really simple. And that doesn't even seem to happen anymore.
No, I agree completely. That was the formulaic thing, whether you were making a congressional hearing, you were doing a print media story, or if you were doing a television segment and you wanted to have left, right, you could have rather sort of mature, non-bombastic experts from the think tank corridors come on and have a almost like a PBS NewsHour kind of discussion about foreign policy, defense, national security, stuff like that. And that really, really changed. I think it really is a function, though, of a lot of these outlets kind of going to Berserkistan in their own coverage. I think that's really what the producers and owners were doing with these outlets. And maybe some of their people went along with it, too. But, I mean, I remember back in the 1990s, I didn't agree with the editorial line of the Washington Post, but I had people who were prominent columnists on the opinion page and prominent reporters from that outlet who would reach me at Heritage to ask questions from time to time. I didn't succeed in persuading them every time or even getting quoted or on air, but there was at least that interaction. I see that as having changed somewhat over the Obama years, where I think that Democrat administrations have kind of held church on who's allowed to be given airtime. If you want to have access to us, then Republicans have been. And then certainly during the Trump years, it just was like a bolt of lightning into the system where they weren't having reasonable conversation during that time.
I'll drop a bomb in on this. One of the biggest things that's happened in Newsroom, when you talk to older editors, older production people, they'll tell you it has been this rise also of the wokeness, political correctness, DEI, where all of a sudden you're sitting in a room. I was very lucky. I worked for 21 years in a Chinese news media. We didn't really have those issues because I was the only white guy in the room.
You were the balance.
I was the balance, weight-wise. Sometimes that I was. But I mean, the thing is that you did see it. I've heard of discussions now. I was speaking with somebody at, I'll just say at BBC, and she told me that like when they talk about the Middle East and Gaza and things like that, if they have somebody on who is like a very able defender of Israel, the conversation from some of the staff who are Muslims becomes that basically we find this guy offensive. We find that, you're a news person, so what? But that's crept into the world. Even at the Wall Street Journal, for example, I know things have come up where they say, oh, we find this offensive. We find this not correct. It makes it feel like a hostile workplace. And I'm like, you're in a newsroom. I mean, everything's supposed to be hostile. It's the reason why, and I'll leave it again, the reason why I think one of the last worlds that people are going to is comedy. The one thing that just completely blows me away, I listen to Joe Rogan sometimes, not all the time. I mean, he's really out there sometimes. And you would think some of the stuff he says would just disqualify him. I mean, I'm not talking about the ivermectin and all that stuff. Just when he gets into these crazy theories with people, UFOs and all that stuff. But I think people keep coming back to him, because they have to, and you see how desperate some candidates are to get on his show, and he just won't let them on. Like, he doesn't bring Trump on for whatever reason. Harris would never go on. Kennedy would do anything he could to get on that show. But the point is all of a sudden now, you think about it, shouldn't we trust our news anchors, the people who, whose job is and then they tell us to be impartial and talk, but instead we've got an MMA commentator, comedian, dirty comedian, who is now more trusted and has a bigger audience than any news network. And he does. I think it's much larger than almost any other news network. And it's not a Rush Limbaugh type thing where he basically was preaching to one side of the audience. It's just amazing. I find that amazing to me, that how the news media has lost people's trust.
Well, great points. All right, that's all the time we have left for today. Special thanks to Steve Yates. Steve, I should mention, of course, you also have your own podcast, The China Desk. Everyone should check that out and subscribe. As for this podcast, if you like the episode, send in a comment, share it with your friends, and be sure to subscribe. We'll be back with another episode soon. Thanks for watching.